All right, for everybody tuning in, we are fixing to begin our Bible class on Wednesday night. We are sharing this to our group and to our church page, so bear with me for just a minute more as we let people log on and let people get in. We will be studying in Exodus. We'll be Exodus 13 tonight. That is Exodus chapter 13 is where we'll be at this evening. I said we'll begin in just a minute. All right, looks like we are everywhere we need to be for tonight. So we'll go ahead and get ready to get started. You know, last week we finished talking about Exodus 12. This was the Passover and the 10th plague that took place. Tonight we will continue in discussing that mind and or that sequence of events and what was involved in that. We will look at, again, more regulations. That's one of the things we'll see here is God will begin to, or Moses and God will begin to intersperse regulations within this story to remind the people about what they are called to do and what they're supposed to do in their keeping the law. Now, you remember that they had just kept the Passover. They had painted the lintels with the blood. And then Pharaoh and the Egyptians told them to get out and drove them out. They told them to go to get basically. And so this is what we're picking up in. And it's sort of right here, chapter 13, the first part of this chapter is a break in this story in that we are told about some regulation that is going to start happening in Israel because of this, something they're going to start doing to honor God. And what that is it's going to be, God is basically going to tell them that they owe him, for lack of better words, they owe him for sparing their firstborn. And therefore, the firstborn of anything is supposed to go to God. And so this is what we're going to see. God's going to lay out some regulations here about the firstborn of what they're supposed to do. Notice verse 1 and 2. The Lord said to Moses, consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine. Now, you notice what God says. God tells Moses, and most people think that what happens here is that Moses has received this beforehand, or he may be receiving it on the road. But God is telling Moses, this is what you're going to do. You're going to consecrate to me. Consecrate to me is another word for sanctify, set apart, make special for me. And he wants us here to see that he wants all the firstborn. Now, we may look at this and say, well, firstborn how? Is this all firstborn or certain like we said before? In verse 2, it's sort of a generic term that's used, but we're going to flip ahead a little with me, if you will, to verse 12. And you'll notice in verse 12 and following, through about verse 15 to 18 or so, we're going to see that God will specify not just firstborn, but firstborn males. Here in the middle of chapter 12, you see all the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. And then he'll talk about the firstborn of man among your sons, you'll redeem. Verse 15, the end of that, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. And so God wants us to see that this firstborn is, although in verse 1 and 2 is generic, he's specifically talking about the males. And again, that was very important because the firstborn male, the firstborn son, has certain rights. He was to be He was to be the firstborn, have the birthright where he gets a double inheritance. He was the one that you would depend upon for your name, most of your name to go through. So the firstborn was very important in the ancient world. In our world today, we may not put as much emphasis in that, but in the ancient world, the firstborn son was a very key role. Again, like Pharaoh, if you were in a position of power, then your son would take your position. And so God says, consecrate, set aside for me everything that opens the womb from among the people of both men and of beasts is mine. And again, the idea is God spared their firstborn from dying under the 10th plague. Therefore, God is owed for that salvation, or the firstborn should be God's if God wouldn't give them away out. And so God says, you've got to set them apart from me. And what they would do, as we learn later, and we'll see this as we go through here, but they would consecrate the firstborn. They would later, I believe it's Numbers is going to tell us that there was a price of 5 shekels for the firstborn of animals and of man. And you would have to pay this consecration or pay this firstborn by the time they're a month old. Within that first, some of the animals about the first 8 days, but for the boys, it was first month. And we see this later on, even in the New Testament. If you remember in Matthew or Luke's account of the New Testament of the birth of Jesus, you'll see Mary and Joseph give birth to Jesus in Bethlehem. And then shortly thereafter, we see them in Jerusalem. And again, according to the timeline, they appear to go back to Bethlehem. Well, we asked the question, why did they go to Jerusalem? They went to Jerusalem because of this, because Jesus was the firstborn of the Son, and therefore he had to be consecrated, set apart to God. And so this is God telling him. And then God's going to go on to expound this, or expound it through Moses, I should say. And we get to verse 3, and this is a very interesting thing that Moses does here, because up to this point, when we see Moses give commands and teachings like this, he typically Moses will say, God spoke to me, and then Moses will speak to the elders, and the elders will go tell the people. Well, here it appears to be that Moses is speaking directly to the people, perhaps of the importance of this, perhaps of the haste in telling them this. And notice what he says. He said to the people, and Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. No unleavened bread, or no leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Aviv, you're going out. And when the Lord brings you to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this service in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand, as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with the strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. So notice what God says here. God speaks through Moses and says, you've got to remember this day. Remember what God has done. And notice the emphasis here of what God has done. And we've seen this in other places. But here again, there is this grounding home of this truth that God brought you out, that God did it. And not did he do it a little bit, but he did it with a strong hand. God brought them out of this place. And therefore, he gives again the rules, the commands of the unleavened bread, where he says that no leavened bread shall be eaten. It's to remind them of the haste in which they had to leave their homes, the haste in which they didn't have time to get ready. They were to be ready, and then they had to leave. And God says, remember this day, because this is the day that you got out of slavery. And this is a day that you're going to remember from now on. It's going to be a memorial for you. Verse 4, he says in the month of Aviv. Now, the month of Aviv is the first month of their year. Remember, God told last week or week before, God told Moses, this will be your first month. You'll keep time from this day. And then the 10th day, you're to select the lamb. And the 14th day, you're supposed to kill that lamb. Then the next day starts the feast of unleavened bread. Here, God says that this is the month of Aviv. Now, the month of Aviv is typically March and April. The word Aviv is the word for harvest, I believe, or some kind of harvest, deals with the barley. You remember earlier in the plagues when God sent the hail, he said the barley hadn't sprouted and hadn't budded yet. Well, it's time for the barley to be sprouting. And so this was a time of new beginning, almost like for the Israelites. And we know this, we sort of recognize this today in that when we keep Easter. Easter is one of those holidays. It's not like Thanksgiving or Christmas where it's a set day every year and you know what day it's going to be. Like Thanksgiving. Well, Thanksgiving, the Thursday. Christmas, it's the 25th of December. Whether that 25th is a Sunday or Friday or Saturday, whatever day it is, that's what it's going to be. In this, but Easter, I was getting the point of Easter. Easter just fluctuates for us. Well, that's because we keep a solar calendar. We go by the sun. We have 12 months in our year. We have so many days in a month. That goes by the cycle of the sun. However, the Jews, kept a lunar calendar. A calendar that went by the moon. The phases of the moon was how they kept theirs, and their calendar was a little shorter than ours. I forget exactly how many days it was shorter, but this is the why Easter fluctuates, because Aviv is Passover. You remember Passover is when Jesus will be crucified. And Passover is when we celebrate Easter. And, we usually take the Sunday closest to that whenever that day falls to be Easter. And, Easter can happen anytime from the middle of March to the end of April. Well, the reason for that is because they're different calendars. It's going by the day of Passover. So I say all that to say this. What we're looking at is March, April time when Israel is leaving out of Canaan and they are going into this wilderness. And so the Lord again tells them, he says, Moses reminds them, when God takes you into the land, he says, you've got to remember this day. Remember this service. Remember this service in this month. God's going to bring you into the land. And again, he reminds them this is not going to be an easy trip. Notice again, this land, the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. There are 5 different groups, he says, that are already in the land. But God's going to give it to you. God's going to give you that land just as he gave you the exit out of Egypt, but that land is going to have something that you're going to have to fight for it. He says, but when you get to that land, remember that it all started, that all those blessings that you get there started here. Remember that all that started back in Egypt. And he said this land that's flowing, a land that is fruitful, that is supplying. And then he says, you shall keep this service. And part of this service is the unleavened bread. Now, this is not the Passover. This is the unleavened bread. He says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. You'll start that. Remember, he told them the first and the 7th day are to be a Sabbath day, a holy day. And when we look at this has implications for us still today, because, when we take the Lord's Supper, if you've ever had to do that bread, or maybe in this pandemic, we've realized that, trying to find unleavened bread and trying to figure out what we can use. Well, the reason we use unleavened bread is because that's what Jesus used. Jesus ate the Passover with his disciples, which would have started this feast of unleavened bread. And so Jesus would have used unleavened bread to that night to remember what they had done, and therefore that's what we use for Lord's Supper. But I want to give you some background there of where this ties to us. But then you notice he tells them, you'll start eating unleavened bread on the 7th day. You're to have a feast to the Lord. You're to have a feast to celebrate and remember what God has done for you. And again, he emphasizes for 7 days, you're not to eat this, you're supposed to eat unleavened bread, no leaven. And you notice that no leaven shall be found, no in you, in all your territory, and any of your people. You're to take leaven completely out of the house. And again, the leaven is the mixture that allows bread to rise. And that's the idea here. This unleavened bread is bread that's not been allowed to rise. That doesn't have that agent that makes it rise and make it not typically what we say bread. More like, you notice, again, unleavened bread is more like a cracker. We consider a cracker than a loaf of bread. Well, that's because it doesn't have the leaven. And then he says, again, notice this. There's this emphasis over and over again here in verse 8. He says, when this happens, you tell your son on that day, this is why we're doing it. You see, God is setting up a system here. God is setting up a system for these people to not only remember what he has done, but also to share that knowledge, with the generation after them, to tell them, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And this is what has happened. And then you notice he says, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Then verse 9, and it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes. He says this is something that's going to be with you always. It shall always be on your mind, always be at the forefront to remember what God has done for you. And then notice again the emphasis, the bookend here, this section. For with a strong hand, the Lord brought you out of Egypt. Not with your strength, not with your miracles, not with anything you've done, but God has brought you out. God has caused these plagues. God has caused Pharaoh to drive you out. God has redeemed you. Therefore, you shall remember this. And again, you notice verse 10, you shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. Now, the only exception here is that the Israelites were told to keep this when they got to Canaan. In the wilderness, they're not commanded to keep this. Exactly why, we're not sure, probably because they were traveling so much and they were not in one place very long. But they're not supposed to keep the feast till they get to Canaan. And therefore, remember where that whole process began. Now, from there, we get to verse 11. This is the second part of this context. The second part of what they're doing. The first is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The second is the consecration of the firstborn. Remember in verse 1 and 2, God says, consecrate for me all the firstborn. Well, what does that mean? Well, now we're going to see what it means. Verse 11, when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. Or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when it comes time for your son, and when in time to come, your son asks, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I will redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. Now, again, notice what Moses is telling the people to do here. He says for it this second part. The first part is remember the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and remember the Passover. Now, you're also going to have to do something for your firstborn sons. And again, remember, when you get to the land of Canaan, this is in the future, do as he's commanded. When you get what he's promised you, again, as he swore to you and your fathers, you shall give it to him, or he shall give it to you. God's going to give you this land, and when he does, you've got something you've got to do. And this is a very interesting thing, that God requires them to do something to be his blessed people. And this is a problem Israel has, is that Israel forgets that God requires them to do something sometimes. At least when we see in the New Testament, Israel seems to be more focused on who they are, that they were born a Jew, and therefore they're God's chosen people and they don't have to do anything. No, there's something they had to do. And that is something we too have to realize as Christians. Now, there are certain things God requires, God asks us to do. And you notice one of the things he calls here is you shall set aside or set apart, you shall consecrate to the Lord all that first opens the womb, the firstborn males. The firstborn male shall be consecrated to God. And notice what he says, the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Now, we're not told here, we're told later that what this means is that when you have an ox or a cow or a sheep or a goat that bears a male, what you have to do is you have to take that to the temple. You have to offer it. You have to sacrifice. I believe for the animals, this is in the first 8 to 10 days after they're born. You're supposed to take it to God and offer it to him, sacrifice again, because it's God's. And the idea is that when you give that firstborn to God, there will be more to come. There will be more offspring that's going to come later. And you're going to have to offer that animal to God in a sacrifice. And later on, God's going to say that if you're not able to sacrifice it, you can buy it, you can redeem it, you can pay for it. That's going to be the price of man. He sort of gives a hint of that here in verse 13 when he talks about the donkey. Now, the reason a donkey is set apart is because what most people think is a donkey is one of the few domesticated animals the Jews would have had that was unclean. The donkey was one of the few ones. They wouldn't have had pigs. They wouldn't have had any of the other animals that were unclean, but the donkey was one of them. And therefore, the donkey, you don't sacrifice the donkey. Now, again, notice the firstborn of the animals in verse 12 shall be the Lord's. Verse 13, you shall redeem the donkey. You shall buy it back. You'll pay for it. Pay for it how? Notice you shall redeem it with a lamb. So what you do is basically you take a young lamb and you offer the lamb in the place of the donkey. And then you notice he says, if you do not redeem it, if you will not offer a lamb in the place of that donkey, that firstborn donkey male, he says you shall break its neck. Now, that seems barbaric to us, and that seems very harsh. Why would God do that? Well, God's teaching these people a very important lesson. God is teaching something that we need to understand, that all that we have is God's, and God could take it all away, but God didn't. And therefore, we need to be thankful to God. Now, the other thing about this is you notice that here he says you should break its neck, not that you'll sacrifice it. Well, why? Well, because the donkey is considered unclean. And an unclean animal, to shed an unclean animal's blood is a major offense before God. Is a major no-no. Matter of fact, when we get into right before the time of Christ, in between the testaments, we see we talk about this in Daniel, FBI. We see a Roman soldier come into the temple, or maybe Greek soldier. I forget exactly which one it is. It's right around 100, 200 BC. He comes into the temple and he sacrifices pigs on the altar, because he knows they're unclean. And therefore, by offering pigs on the altar, he makes the altar unclean and unfit for service to God. And the priests who fight him, they basically have to come back and have to purify the altar before they can offer anything else on it again. And so this is why God says, if you don't redeem the donkey, you got to break its neck. You got to kill it, sacrifice it basically to me, but do not sacrifice it the way you would a lamb. It would cost it its life, but not his life in a sacrifice. And then you notice, every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. Again, notice these two, the man and the donkey, are to be redeemed, not the Lord's. They shall not be the Lord's, meaning they shall not be sacrificed. Same thing with God. This is another interesting thing about God. The Egyptians, the Canaanites, all those people living in Canaan, all those pagan cities around them, all the pagan people we've studied, there's a majority of their gods who required a human sacrifice, who wanted human sacrifice to them. We read about some of in the Old Testament who wanted children sacrificed to them. Again, this is all man-made, but they wanted children. But the interesting thing about our God never tells his people, you have to sacrifice people. He never tells them, you need to sacrifice the Gentiles. You need to offer up a Gentile to please me. No, he offers the blood of bulls and goats. That's what the Hebrew writer talk about. Our God is such a caring, loving God, a concerned God about his world, that he doesn't demand the life of humans. The only two times we see the human sacrifice even mentioned or halfway referenced is one, Abraham, when Abraham offers or goes to try to offer Isaac up, and God stops him. The other will be maybe Jesus' son, God's son, Jesus, that he was a sacrifice for the behalf of sins, but he wasn't a sacrifice on the altar in that way. So there's one way you can look at it. There was never a sacrifice on an altar to God of a human life. And that shows us that now what that applies to us is that shows us how valuable, how important human life is, that God was not willing to offer it. God was not willing to accept it. The Jews may have wanted to offer it, but God wouldn't accept it, because that's not what God wanted. And therefore, we continue on here. And he says what happens, what this will do is, again, forms a teaching moment. Remember the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Your children shall ask, well, why don't we do this, Daddy? Well, here's why we do it. Again, your son asked, what does this mean? Why do we sacrifice the firstborn male? Why do we offer a lamb in place of donkey? Why does, again, probably maybe a cousin to this boy, he sees their newborn child and they have to offer something in its place. What does this mean? And then notice again what he says. The book ends. You shall say to him, by a strong hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt. 4 times this phrase is repeated, by a strong hand. The Lord brought us out. Again, not that they did it, not that they've done anything to earn it, but God did it by his mercy. God brought us out from Egypt, from the house of slavery. And then he says, you tell them a little bit about it. Verse 15, for when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Notice, all this lies at God's feet. It lies at God's feet. God takes full credit. God takes full credit for all that has happened, for all that's done. And this all was done to prove that he is the true God. He is the Almighty God, that he is the one that has redeemed his people. And he says, therefore, because God killed all the Egyptian firstborn sons, he killed all the firstborn animals of Egyptians because the Egyptians refused to let us go. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first open the womb, but all the firstborns of my sons I will redeem. He says, therefore, knowing that God has spared me the loss of my firstborn, I offered a sacrifice in its place. I offer a sacrifice in its place. If it's an animal, I offer that animal. But if it's a man or an unclean animal, he says he offers a sacrifice in its place. He redeems it. He buys it back. Why? Because it's God's. That's the idea throughout this whole thing, is that because God spared Israel, the firstborn sons belong to him. They're his. And to use them, to keep them, they have to buy them. If they're sacrificed, if they're a clean animal because they're God's, God says sacrifice them. Sacrifice them. They're mine. I choose what to do with them. The firstborn son, you want the firstborn son, it's my son. You want him back, you've got to redeem him. You've got to pay a price. You've got to pay for that son. And then he knows verse 16, it shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes. For by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. Again, the idea here is this is going to be something that's going to be a constant reminder of what you do. Now, some Jews, even in modern days, have taken this quite literally. They wear what's called phylacteries on their garments. They have little boxes that contain scriptures, and they'll be worn on the wrist, or they'll be worn as a headband and have a little box between their eyes. And they keep verses like this and say, well, this because I'm supposed to keep this as something close to me. This word that I look at is something to remind me. Well, I don't know if that's exactly what God is meaning here, but God is calling for them to remember. Whenever you have a firstborn, whether it be son or whether it be a firstborn animal, you remember what God did. Remember how God spared you. How God saved his people by letting them go, by killing the Egyptians, not the Israelites, to prove who he was. And so Moses lays out this pattern of what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to how they're supposed to remember God, how they're supposed to sacrifice to God, and what they are called to accomplish. Now, the rest of this chapter, verse 17 and following, is going to tell us about, it picks back up the story. Picks back up, okay, the Israelites have left Egypt, they've left Goshen. They went from Ramesses to Succoth. That's where we left them, was Succoth. Again, where these cities are, we don't know. These cities have lost their names in time. Either their names have been changed, or history hasn't found them yet, or archaeologists haven't found them yet. But this is what God does. Now, notice beginning verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people of God go, or let the people go, God did not lead them the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their mind when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. And they moved on from Succoth and encamped in Etham, on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. So notice what happens. Pharaoh lets the people go, and now Moses tells us a little bit about what God's plan is. God's going to set the people free. God's going to take them to Canaan, but God doesn't take the direct route. Notice he doesn't take them by way to the land of the Philistines. Now, if you look at a map, and I apologize, I meant to put a map in here, but I forgot. If you look at the map of that area, the way of the Philistines is basically to go along the coast. The Philistines lived along the coast south of Canaan. And there was a major road that they would have been able to take from Egypt straight into Canaan. And they would have begun their conquest there, but God didn't do that. Well, why? Well, God didn't do it for a few reasons, I believe. One is God did not leave them there, as he says here, lest the people change their minds when they see war. God knew people would fight them. Well, who? Some think the Philistines would have fought them, and they probably are true, because we'll see later when the Israelites march through certain areas, their people will try to fight them and try to keep them from passing through their lands. But the other thing about this is that if they would have taken this road of the Philistines, this way of the Philistines, the major road, they would have run into some garrisons of Egyptian army. And if the Egyptians if Pharaoh had to send a fast horseman ahead of them, he could have notified those other places about who was coming, and they could have tried to stop them. And so God, I think, is avoiding the Egyptians. He's avoiding the Philistines. God's avoiding everybody he can to keep Israel, because Israel is not ready for war. There are people who've just got out of slavery. They're not. We don't have any indication they're any kind of trained soldiers. A few may have been, but not many. And so God led them around the wild, as he says, led them around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. God led them south. They should have went east, or would have went east and went straight up, but God led them south. God led them south toward the wilderness. And this is what we're going to see later, is that Pharaoh's going to see them, and he's going to think they're going crazy because he thinks they're in the wilderness. Now, there's no hope for them. And again, this is God proving who he is. And so God leads them south to the Red Sea. A little bit in literature called foreshadowing. Because if this is the first time you read Exodus, you don't know what's going to happen at the Red Sea. And this is that first mention of God sending them down south to the Red Sea. And he knows they went up out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. Now, the idea equipped for battle means they probably would have had their slings. They would probably have some bows and arrows. There's reference later to having some swords. They wouldn't have been a full army, but they would have had some. And what most people think this means is they went equipped for battle, or went with a military style, is they would have caused what was called in the ancient world a phalanx group. And what this is basically the head of your group is like a spear. And in that spear, in that triangle, is your soldiers, your armed men. And they're able to, if an army attacks, they're able to protect the people behind them. And so this phalanx would have marched through, and their soldiers would have been in the front. And that's what most people think this probably means, is that the fighting men were at the front being ready for any trouble. And again, if they'd run into much trouble, they would have probably retreated and probably gave up. They wouldn't have stood much of a fight. So Moses gets ready to go. Now, verse 19 gives us a little bit of hastening back to Genesis. Remember, Moses and the Israelites have been here for 430 years. And that was during the time of Joseph when they got here. So 400 years have passed, a little bit around 400 years. And Moses remembers Joseph's plea, the promise made to Joseph. I think Moses remembers it probably because God told him to. I believe God told Moses, look, you'll get the bones of Joseph. You'll get the bones of Joseph and carry them out. And so Joseph's bones, that promise in Genesis, is carried out in Exodus. that these bones will be carried with them. And again, you notice what Joseph said. Joseph made them swear that they would take him out. Why? He says, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. Joseph says, God's going to come. I believe, I know God's going to come. And therefore, I don't want you to leave my bones here. I want you to take me back to Canaan. Now, what's interesting about this idea of Joseph is they carried Joseph's bones with them for another 40, 50 years, actually, because it's not Joseph's bones is with them when they wandered the wilderness for 40 years. Joseph's bones are with them when Joshua begins to capture the land of Canaan. It's not until after the land of Canaan is captured later in the book of Joshua that we find out that Joshua's bones are buried in Shechem, one of the cities that Jacob would have inhabited or been near. And so this again is that remembering Genesis promise, but also foreshadowing what's going to come in the future. Now, God told us all this to take us to the next part. Where in verse 20, they moved from Succoth and encamped toward Etham at the edge of the wilderness. They're getting away from the civilized, they're getting away from the cities. They're getting out in the wilderness. And again, this is another word that is different from us, because when we hear the word wilderness, we think of woods. We think of going out in the woods, like where you go deer hunt or you go to a national park. You go in the wilderness. Their wilderness was not woods. Their wilderness was desert. So here they are getting on the edge of the desert. They're getting out there in the middle of nowhere. And this is where God wants them to be. And they know this is where God wants to be. For the last verse of this chapter, last two verses, is God goes before them. God leads them by day by a pillar of cloud. There's no doubt where God wants them to go because God's leading them. And then by night, he leads them in that pillar of fire. Why? So they can travel day and night. This group, now again, remember, this is 2 million people who are having to travel. And so if you've got 2 million people in this caravan traveling, that doesn't mean they probably travel day and night. Because by the time the front of the group gets moving and gets settled to where they're at, it's probably going to be a few hours later by the time the end of that group comes in and they get settled. And then the next day or so, when you leave again, that first half gets moving a little quicker than the back half. And so most people think there's probably hours it would take for this caravan to stop and start, for it to fully get moving and then fully come to a close. And this shows God's presence in it. God is not just with the front of that group. God's with the entire group. The entire group can see this pillar of fire and can see this pillar of cloud. And so again, God stays with them. You know, verse 22, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. They constantly saw this. They were constantly beholding, and they constantly saw God. God's presence was there. Again, this is to emphasize the one phrase that is repeated in chapter 13, that the Israelites left Egypt by the mighty hand of God. It's only because of God that they have gotten out. It's only because of God they're going to stay out of Egypt. Notice you're going to see times from here on out when Israel, God's going to say Israel would have went back, or Israel's going to say, I wish we could go back, but God is going to be the one that drives them forward. God's going to be the one that keeps them moving forward. Why? Because God is with them, and God has made a promise to them. God has made a promise not to them necessarily, but to their fathers, and God keeps his word. Now, that's where I want to end with us tonight, is thinking about that idea that God keeps his word. One of the greatest things about this chapter and about this whole Exodus story is how God keeps his word. When God says he will do something, he'll do it. It may not be in our time, it may not be in our way, but when God makes a promise, God's going to keep it. And that's what we see here. God made a promise to Israelites. God made a promise to Abraham. I'm going to give the land of Canaan to your children. Now, Abraham didn't know it's going to be nearly 500 years later before his children get that. But God promised it was going to happen, and God made it happen. Same is true with us. The promises God has made to us that will happen, they will happen. They may not happen in our time. They may not happen in our time frame. They may not happen the way we want them to happen. But they will happen. And just as God told Israel to remember what I've done for you, we have to do the same. We have to remember that God has saved us. God has redeemed us. God has taken care of us. If we'll follow him, if we'll obey him, if we'll be the people he's called us to be. Thank you for joining us here tonight for our study. Continue to remember those we mentioned on our prayer list is sick. One other one that I forgot to put in our bulletin or forgot to announce. Continue to remember the Cliff Gerald. He is still at the Tupelo Hospital, from my understanding, not doing well with COVID. So remember his family in our prayers. Again, others were mentioned in our bulletin on our devotional. Remember them in your prayers. Remember this Sunday morning, we meet at 10 a.m. at the building. We also have our YouTube and Facebook videos be streaming live. I encourage you to join us. And again, if there's anything we never do for you, please let us know. But for tonight, I hope you have enjoyed our study of Exodus 13. We'll pick up next week in Exodus 14. But for tonight, we're going to be done. And we hope that you're all having a great week, and we hope to see you soon.